We talked about this a little bit in the break. How is all this going to change the banking industry? I think there's a couple of things to talk about. Firstly, we're going to see the rise of rival currencies. The phenomenon, and this is the image of Bitcoin, of edge currencies, currencies which aren't undervalued, which aren't supported by government. We're seeing the development of networked currencies. I'm not sure whether something like Bitcoin, or whether Bitcoin itself will be successful. But I would certainly suggest that you need to watch very carefully that the financial sector, like these other sectors, can be radically blown up. Think about how the self-driving car changes everything in manufacturing. Automobiles. It decimates the entire security. You no longer need seatbelts. You no longer need airbags. Think about how P2P networks have destroyed the music business. Alternative currencies change everything in finance. And it changes the role of banks. What is the role of bank in Bitcoin with a distributed currency? I have no idea. But this is something that you shouldn't, my advice at least, would be not to poo-poo it, to say, oh, it will never happen to us. Every sector says that. Schools said it, universities said it, newspapers said it, the music industry said it, government said it. But every sector has been blown away. Now, one of the other questions that came up in the break was the future of physical banks. Are people going to continue in the networked age to go into their local bank? And I very much doubt that's the case. Just as they stop eventually reading newspapers, just as people will eventually undermine every aspect, I think, of retail, the physical bank itself will become more and more superfluous, or more and more questionable. Now, this may be bad news for some of you. In America, for example, very few people use their physical banks. Personally, I can go for months by just using ATMs. But what's the interesting opportunity about digital is that all digital communications get commodified. The physical suddenly appears more valuable. So the bank branch, the physical store, the retail outlet, needs to be in some ways reinvented. Think about how Apple reinvented retail. Think about the Apple retail experience of going in to buy a computer at Apple versus most traditional electronic retailers. I think the same will happen eventually with banks. You will see innovators who will reinvent the physical bank, whether it's as places for communities to meet, places where you harness and develop your data, other kind of networking opportunities. I think my advice again to you, certainly on the retail section, is don't take for granted that banks will always exist in the way they have. You certainly shouldn't think that. And you need to radically rethink everything. You need to take risks. Again, in my conversations over the break, one of the things that came out is that risk-taking is good. If you stick to the old certainties in this digital economy, in this dynamic world, you will inevitably die. Everything is changing in this world. And as everything changes, so the role of the bank, the physical bank. And I think that banking, and this is not a subject that I've given that much thought to, but in terms of this conversation and this community, I think banks do have a unique opportunity because it's a trust economy. Everything is built around trust. And historically, banks have been better than anyone else at trust. And indeed, in a world where we trust fewer and fewer people, banks, or at least outside the kind of Wall Street-style banking meltdown, banks have maintained still more trust than most other institutions. Is that true? I mean, in the research you've done, has there been a run on trust in the banks? Is anything changing, or as consumers trust fewer and fewer institutions, are banks actually more and more trusted?
Not in Asia. Asia is the line as far as trust and
I think that's a good thing. I think it's something that you need to leverage and build on. But rethinking the bank. Banks are all about protecting value. And as the nature of value changes, as it shifts from cash to data, and as it shifts to the network, so I think banks have a very interesting opportunity to reinvent themselves. I'm not going to talk much. I mean, you all know that guy. It's Julian Assange. Again, just like Edward Snowden, these new figures are blowing things up. People who are taking old secrets and revealing them are really central to this revolution. I think there's a new movie out about Assange. He's the other face of a Snowden. Again, you don't want Assanges in your organization, but you will have them, any organization.